So welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. On behalf of the France Chicago Center and the Department of Political Science, I want to invite and welcome you all to a workshop with Daniel Defert. So it's really a pleasure to have Daniel back in Chicago. I think that it's fair to say that the University of Chicago is Daniel Defert's home in the United States. Daniel Defert was here in 1961, actually, for a few months, when he was a student at the École Normale Supérieure and received a fellowship through the Rotary Club to come to the United States. And there was only one place that he thought that people did social science properly, and that was at the University of Chicago. That was the one place he wanted to come, and that's where he came. And he came with the Rotary Club, so had a lot of elegant dinners downtown, I think, but was mostly down in Hyde Park, following courses and classes with Edward Shills, and enjoying himself here. He came back in 2000 at the invitation of Jan Goldstein, and was lectured and spoke about the history of his efforts in combating AIDS and setting up the major organization in France, AIDS, which is the organization that has fought against the spreading of AIDS in France. And he spoke about that. He also followed some classes by James Coleman on human capital, so it was another great Chicago experience, and he's back now. And we hope that you will come back more regularly.
I'm old.
As you all know, Daniel Defert has many arrows in his quill. Not only is he someone who has a lot of engagement not only against AIDS with the foundation of the AIDS movement and the group, but also much earlier in the 1970s, at the time of these lectures, actually, that we'll be discussing, with the formation of the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, which was being formed precisely at the time at which Foucault would deliver the first set of lectures at the Collège de France. He is also an author and has written in the field of anthropology. He wrote a lot on travel journals of the 16th century and on the history of settlement, colonization, and relationships with Native Americans. And much of that work has been translated in a journal that's at the New School. So if you're interested in that particular strand of his work, you can go there. And then, of course, he has spent a lot of the last few years editing and supervising the publication of the works of Michel Foucault. He edited with François Eval the Die en Écrit, which were the volumes of the writings, interviews that were published as books. That came out in 1994. Has supervised many of the other lectures and edited the most, I would say, the course which we're going to be talking about today, Leçons sur la volonté de savoir, which was the first course at the Collège de France in 1970-71, which is one of the most recent that were published, the most recent being Gouvernement des Vivants, which was 1980, 10 years later. But one that is going to be coming out in English translation. It was supposed to be today or tomorrow, but it's going to be in 15 days. So this was going to coincide with the American publication of the book, and we were all going to be sitting in front of, reading the text along with Daniel Defert. But the timing just didn't work exactly. But we are thrilled to have Daniel Defert to give us the preview of the lectures. Again, these were the lectures that were written at the exact same time as the GIP was being formed, and so they take up the issues that are so central to so many of us about the relationship between knowledge and its embeddedness in power relations, and the relationship to law, which plays a central role in these lectures. So without anything more, let me introduce Daniel Defert.
Thank you very much. everything has been said, and, and even a little more. And thank you for this invitation and this meeting with so many young researchers. I thought of giving a lecture, and then I changed my mind because Bernard Harcourt mentioned it was a seminar. So I thought it would be nice in a seminar to discuss some documents which have been using for the preparation of the edition of this course. And I've not thought that documents had to be reproduced. And Jane Goldstein said at noon, have you reproduced those documents for us? And so now they are here, so it will be a real seminar. We'll have very little to do, and you will have to read a few pages in French to be able to ask me questions. And I will not, of course, tell much about the contents of this course because it will be edited in a fortnight, and I hope you will read it. But I will just raise a few questions I had editing Foucault, because it's not so easy to edit Foucault, because it's a more complicated author than we usually believe. These first lectures pronounced by Foucault at the Collège de France between December 1970 and March 71 were not recorded. It was not the custom at that time to record lectures, and we were not the apparatus for that. We call that a NAGRA. I don't know how you call it. It was a big apparat that has been used for certain lessons, but it has been erased afterwards, so I have no proof of the translation. So we had to work on the manuscripts. And as far as I'm rather familiar with Foucault's handwriting, I accepted to do this translation into legible language. And in fact, some people recorded, the following years, people started to record Foucault lectures, and they asked him to be authorized to record. And when Foucault left a will telling no posthumous publication, but he had let people record his lessons. So we had some wild printing all over in Italy, in Hong Kong, in Brazil. So we decided to have a sort of standard edition. And arrived at the last period when we had no record, and we had to use the manuscript, which according to a classical definition are achromatic manuscripts. It means not destined to be read, but to be heard, as was philosophy since Plato. So, these lessons, to my opinion, are rather programmatic of the whole series of themes that will be treated between 1970 and 1984 at the Collège de France. I mean, that concern a political history of truth. A reflection on truth is central in history of philosophy. What is surprising here is the way Foucault proceeds, using mainly historical material, and historical material from the most respected historian of Greek antiquity, from the first important in the discipline, I would say, Louis Gernet or Glotz, to the latest, the Edouard Ville, who made some digging in Corinthia and wrote very new material on the history of money in Corinthia. And that was in 2 years before Foucault gave those lectures. So he has been using the official corpus of historian of the antiquity. I'm afraid those pages will fly away. and I will not finish. So this, in my second surprise, and it was not only my surprise, it was the surprise of most of people who attended the lectures of Foucault, the first lectures at the Collège de France, were these lectures on history or were they lectures on philosophy? And there was a question all the way, is it history or is it philosophy? And it is an important question which I had, in a way, to interpret, to understand what was going on. The second surprise is, in this lesson, Foucault abandoned the epistemological framework he has been using usually since the history of madness to the birth of the clinic or to the order of things. The theater of truth he explored here is the procedures followed by justice, increased justice. When I use the expression theater of truth, it's an expression that Foucault used, speaking of the hospitals in the birth of the clinic. And I think in every book of Foucault, you have a theater of truth. The asylum has been the theater where psychiatry had its birth. Hospital has been also the birth of anatomopathology. Medical and legal reflection and structures has been the theater of birth of the truth, supposed truth on sexuality. And in this lesson, Foucault explored a new theater of truth, which is the history of justice. Justice being the birth of truth. And mainly the scene of the tribunal. And it starts from Homeric text until the classical democracy in the Athenian city. To my opinion, it's an opinion. I will not affirm that, but this course is entirely related to a recent rereading of Nietzsche. Nietzsche has been since 1953 a main source of philosophical reflection for Foucault. But I think we can see that in a very recently published here, the introduction to Kant anthropology, which is very deeply a Nietzschean reflection on Kant. But he abandoned that type of reflection inspired by Nietzsche in this course, and I think, according to a letter he sent me in 1967, I'm rereading Nietzsche. I have pleasure rereading Nietzsche. It's a very fun expression I've forgotten. Je m'amuse à relire Nietzsche, and what fascinates me, it's the will to know, which we have not remarked in favor of a will to power. And the will to know is the main theme of all the courses that Foucault delivered in the Collège de France. The theme of knowledge seems to have been central in Nietzsche in the years of 1880, when what we call in French, I don't know what the expression, maybe it's the same word, neo-Kantism was dominant, still dominant in Germany. And there is a deep criticism of Nietzsche of neo-Kantism. And that has been the main source of reflection for Foucault for his first readings of Nietzsche. One of the difficulties we have when we read that course, those lectures, is that we have in English, according to Graham Burchell, who did the translation, only one word in English to translate two words, and the distinction is very important for Foucault. It's the concept of knowledge as connaissance and the concept of knowledge as savoir. Knowledge as connaissance in traditional philosophy is the faculty of knowledge, and sort of transcendental faculty, at least since Kant, but almost we can say in the tradition of philosophy. And knowledge as savoir is the product of that faculty of knowledge. And what is central for Foucault is not the faculty, which supposes subject of knowledge. It's the product of that faculty, which has a variety of origins. It can be passion, fight, desire, every possibilities of confrontation may bring something, what we call a savoir, something we consider altogether as a knowledge or as being, as Heidegger would say. He said that savoir, pouvoir, and being is about the same thing. So what concerns Foucault in these lectures is savoir and not knowledge. But with the translation, you will find just one word to play on the two meanings. The will to know has been identified by Heidegger as an important element of the will to power in Nietzsche. But Heidegger referred to the falsified will to power. You know, this famous volume edited by the sister of Nietzsche to please the political setting of the 30s. This book has been deconstructed by Colli and Montinari, the two Italians who republished the whole work of Nietzsche, and which is now the authority on Nietzschean studies. And so Foucault referred to this new Nietzsche without that work on the will to power. So in doing that work on savoir, Foucault is also doing, and it's not written at all in the text, a critique of the Heideggerian lecture of Nietzsche. And for many reasons. One reason is that, yes, Foucault admitted that he really discovered the philosophical meaning of Nietzsche when he read Heidegger in 1953-54. He read Nietzsche. The Nietzsche by Heidegger was not entirely published, even in German, but there were some lectures which are components of that book, which have been edited in German, and Foucault lived in Germany, and I've read them in German. But in 1971, Klossowski, a friend of Deleuze and Foucault, was just translating the Nietzsche by Heidegger. And so Foucault, while he deconstructs the Heideggerian construction of Nietzsche, is fighting the coming book of Heidegger, which is being translated. And that's the problem always with Foucault. Say, you read a book about Greek history, and people were surprised. It's entirely philosophical, entirely polemical, with no polemics at all. Foucault hates polemics as soon as the other is almost destroyed. So what I want to insist on is the fact that when you read Foucault, you have to have in mind a different level of lectures. The most apparent level, history, and we will have to discuss that, is just an apparent, means of expression. It's an entire methodology, and we will have to discuss that. The second aspect, it's a new Nietzscheism which is being produced. You know that the fate of Nietzsche in France has been very important at two periods. One with Charles Handler, who was a socialist, and always Nietzsche has been read rather on the left side in France. And the first reading in the 30s by Charles Handler. There is a second reading which started after the war in 1945 with Georges Bataille, who waited the end of the war to publish his Nietzsche because he wanted to show that Nietzsche was not the Nazi philosopher what her sister has produced, but he waited 1955 to publish his Nietzsche. And there is absolutely a new reading, which is just starting in those years with Deleuze and Foucault. And this new reading of Nietzsche is not so easily evident when we read the course. And we have to do a sort of speculation. And it is that speculation which, normally, when we edit a course of Foucault, we are not supposed to interpret. And of course, we have just to understand and find the exact words of the manuscripts. But sometimes, to have sense, you have, of course, to propose, at least in the context which we write after each volume of course, we write a contextualization. We have to write a sort of contextualization. But this contextualization has been very important for my own understanding of these lectures. Even if I attended the lectures, it was quite, after 30 years, it was rather obscure to edit them. And so what I will propose to you will be to discuss those few points of interpretation which for them have brought some documents. The first problem of interpretation does deserve documents. I will just discuss it. Yes, while the documents are. So you have.
Right, do you want to pass some of these around? I think we probably need to share. So one for two, maybe?
Yes. The first problem I had to solve was a problem of title. Foucault said at the beginning of the first lectures that the will to truth will be the name of this course, and it could be the name of most his work. And in fact, he gave it to the first volume of his History of Sexuality. And the history of the sexuality, as you know, is a genealogy. It's a genealogy in two ways. It's the genealogy of what we consider as our science of sexuality. But also, it's a genealogy because in our society, sexuality is part of our morals. So it's a genealogy of our morals as well. So the first volume of the History of Sexuality is a genealogy of knowledge and a genealogy of morals. This first volume, called by Foucault himself, Will to Truth, we could not reutilize the word because it would have been confusing with a book already published. So this book, in fact, could have been called Genealogy of Knowledge. You know, there is a volume entitled by Foucault, The Archaeology of Knowledge, and this one is the Genealogy of Knowledge. He used the phrase once. He has not used it as a title, and he has never insisted very much on the expression. But it's a central theme of his lectures in the Collège de France. So we choose a title very easy, Lessons on the Will to Truth. because I had a piece on Oedipus, which was not part of this series of lectures and so on. So it's a series of lessons. But you have to understand the book as a genealogy of Marvel. I said it is a new Nietzscheanism. When we write the contextualization of a cause, we usually consider what Foucault was writing at the same time. Of course, I was present in everyday life and in the lectures, but most of the other people who edited have to reconsider from Foucault's writing what was the context. Anyway, what was the context? There was there was a strong political context. It was the period where we were constructing the JIP. I was member of the Maoist group, who was rather activist, and the book refers of absolutely no actual social fight. It's a book on pure historical facts from the 6th century before, I don't know if to say before our period or before Christ, I don't know, I'm always embarrassed. I say, I don't know what is the custom here. No,
don't worry about
it.
You
know to what I refer. So it started 6th century before. And so people could be surprised that it was so far away of the actual involvement of Foucault in politics. The most important texts written at that time by Foucault were on Deleuze, and mainly on a very difficult book. I think the most important book of philosophy written by Deleuze, Différence et Répétition. And at that time, when it was published, honestly, I've absolutely not been able to understand that book. And when Foucault wrote admirable essay twice on this book, I wonder, I've really not understood his enthusiasm. The enthusiasm was so great that even he imitates Deleuze's style. The result is, it's not very clear to understand what he says about Deleuze. But he wrote two enthusiastic essays. And I had to take this book, Différence and Répétition. I read it again. And suddenly, I discovered the Différence and Répétition was largely a discussion with Foucault. And discourse is a discussion with Deleuze. So, you say, well, the first difficulty, you read a book which concerns Greek remote antiquity, and it's a dialogue about Nietzsche between two Nietzscheans who would never speak of Nietzsche. But they critique Heidegger, both of them. So, what is difference and repetition? After many readings, it's a rewriting of être et temps, being and time, or time and being, how you read it, being and time. It's a rewriting of, not exactly a rewriting of being and time, but partly a rewriting of being and time. From which point of view? From the point of view of Nietzsche. And Heidegger has rewritten Nietzsche from the point of view of Heidegger in Being and Time. So, in a way, you can read Being and Time as a rewriting of Nietzsche. And what Deleuze does is a rewriting of time and being. And what appears is that an ontology of, it's difficult for me to find the exact English word, an ontology of difference. And the question of the eternal return in Nietzsche has lost its sort of mystical or metaphysical aspect, and it has a new reality, which is the return of the perpetual return of differences. We are in a world of perpetual differences. And suddenly, honestly, I understood what was the archaeology of knowledge, which I think I've never understood before, because Foucault never explained it. When a thing is said, it is said forever, and it will return. And what is the archaeology of knowledge? A thing which has been said, which has been repeated in a newer environment, a newer conceptual frame, it is never lost. And I don't remember the last quotation of Shah, which is at the end of the volume on sexuality. The same thing returned, but we have always to resist, something like that. I don't remember the phrasing, which is absolutely beautiful, so beautiful I've forgotten. But that's the meaning of the archaeology of knowledge, is that something which has been said once will exist and will be reinterpreted, will return, but in a new context, in a new phrasing, in a new conceptual frame. And so what Foucault did, it was purely about language, about linguistic problems and scientific problems. And what Deleuze did was about ontological problems. And that's an important difference I would like to discuss later on. But I will I want you to see how I arrived to this conclusion, that it was entirely to be read as a discussion with Deleuze. You have in your hands text, in French, of course. I had the idea today at noon, thanks to Jan Goldstein, to propose your reproduction, but have not the time to invent the translation or to look for the existing translation. But if you have the text in hand, and if you are familiar with French, page 171, you see, beaucoup de gens ont intérêt à dire que tout le monde sait ceci, que tout le monde reconnaît ceci, que personne ne peut nier ceci. Many people have interest to say that everyone knows ceci, everyone recognizes ceci, nobody can deny this. Le philosophe, of course, proceed with more disinterest. The philosophe poses things as universally recognized. C'est seulement ce que signifie penser être et moi, c'est-à-dire non pas ceci, mais la forme de la représentation ou de la recognition en général. La forme la plus générale de la représentation est donc dans l'élément d'un sens commun comme nature droite et bonne volonté. So this general statement that anyone has access to anything in terms of knowledge is just a moral hypothesis that the human nature is good. And being good, of course, by nature, we have access to knowledge and truth. So the simple proposal that anyone have access to knowledge and truth is a moral hypothesis, and that's typically Nietzschean. It's the hypothesis that we have a good nature, and good nature is an access to truth. How Foucault starts his lectures. I will take the English text this time. Where I put it? Yes, it will be the page 5 and the Foucault starts his lesson on the 9th of December 1997 with a long commentary of Aristotle, and we discover that this simple phrase I've just read to you was a simple journalistic transposition of Aristotle. A well-known, quite banal passage whose initial margin position in the metaphysics seems to keep to the edge of the word. All men by nature, Foucault, desire to know. The proof of this is the pleasure caused by sensation, for even apart from their usefulness, we enjoy them for themselves and visual sensation more than the others. So this very simple phrase by Deleuze was a commentary of Aristotle. So they were just starting with the main basis and with the same analysis that there is a paradigm of knowledge given by Aristotle and Plato, opposed to another paradigm of knowledge given by Nietzsche, for whom we have no natural access to knowledge. Knowledge is the result of conflict, and so we don't access to knowledge, neither to truth, simple by regard, by sensation, by the eye, by sensation, by human body, by human nature. Knowledge is agonistic. And what is the best representation of an agonistic truth is not justice. So we have to go back to the history of justice to understand how something has been considered as truth. And Foucault goes as far as Homeric text to follow from Homer to Hesiod and then to Clisthène how the legal institutionalization of justice as truth, dikaion kai alates, just and true, has been settled. And what has been treated in the preceding books of Foucault was how knowledge has been created in terms of an epistemology, and now we will consider only relation of power, agonistic situation, to understand how a truth has been possible, how a truth has been said. So I think we will discuss this later together later on, but there is a lot of proof these texts, from the sources used, from discussion led, that this is a discussion with Deleuze. It starts from the same basis and it goes along with Deleuze. But in Deleuze, there is a very interesting passage, which is on the text you have, page 85. Where Deleuze discusses the most important method of Plato, which is the logical processes, the method of division. Is it division? Division. Yes, as a logical process to analyze knowledge. And if you read what Deleuze says, le seul problème qui traverse toute la philosophie de Platon, qui préside à sa classification des sciences ou des arts, c'est toujours de mesurer les rivaux, de sélectionner les prétendants, de distinguer la chose et ses simulacres au sein d'un pseudo-genre ou d'une grosse espèce. So if you analyze the philosophy of Plato, you will remind that what is the principle of his classification of sciences of art. It's always to measure rivals, to select pretenders, to distinguish the thing itself and its appearance, the simulacrum. Mm-hmm. So what makes the difference? It's not a logical process, it's a selective process. So it's a valorization. So we are again in a Nietzschean lecture of Plato. And all the book of Deleuze is on to construct an anti-Platonician philosophy. And how Plato proceeds to establish those distinctions. It cannot proceed purely by a logical technique. He always recurs to stories, to myth. And every time that Plato wants to explain why this has been selected, he tells a story, a myth. In Plato recurs to a myth. It seemed that division, as soon as it abandoned its mask of specification and revealed its real target, renounced to realize this target and is relayed by a simple play of a myth, the game of the myth. Le jeu de Platon, says Deleuze. That's a recourse to myth. And what I was very surprised by in the very first lesson, Foucault exposed his project as a game. He said, my game will be. I said, how in the Collège de France, for the first lessons, which is rather impressive, he said, yes, my game will be. And I think it has no other meaning than to oppose that game of Foucault to the game of Plato. And the game of Plato, there is no solution. He has to rely on myth. Except in one case, when he speaks of the exclusion of the sophist, where he can tell a real story. And Foucault devoted 2 lessons of the exclusion of the sophist in this course, which was a real social, political, and logical period in the Greek history. But what is the game of Foucault? The game of Foucault, to my opinion, I must say it's my opinion, of course, it's to rely on history. It cannot have an ontology like Deleuze, but it can explain everything through history. So it seems to be a course about Greek history, but it is the game of Foucault, not to recourse to an ontology, which is still in Deleuze, but to stay on the only theme of genealogy. So history here is the history of fight, of social fight, of political fight, and it's the way how the truth emerged in the democratic society of the 4th century in the Greek city. So we have a full history of the birth of legal and judicial processes of establishing the truth. And so we have the game of Foucault, which is not the symbol play, it's a philosophical play, opposed to the game of Plato, according to Deleuze. So you see, at the first reading of this, and when listening to those lessons, of course, worst, when listening to those lessons, I think no one could really understand what was at stake. There was really a special dialogue between two persons. We were very close to each other, and we were too shy to discuss between themselves, but we would write a lot of things, not in conflict, but in an agonistic way on certain philosophical issues. So that's the first aspect I would like to discuss, because it supposes a new reading of the archaeology of knowledge and a new reading of the whole of history, which is a philosophical role to occupy the scene occupied by ontology in many other philosophers. Another problem which I would like to attract your attention on is the fact that Foucault was also referring, I told you he was referring to historians, a lot of historians. In fact, I counted 80 historians, 80, we read, and we got quotations. And as he was always doing that, he was reading all what was accessible and would take some information. Amongst those historians, there were two very important for different reasons. One was Marcel Detienne, and the other was Jean-Pierre Vernant. Gernet, yes, he was important, Gernet, but not so important for another reason. Of course, he used Gernet because Gernet has proposed this notion of, I don't know, we would say, pré-droit. Pre-law. And that's a very important element. Yesterday, there was a discussion in the other department about custom. Oh yes, about custom and law, and there is a long discussion of Foucault about customs, which are rituals, which are ceremony, which are really ceremonies of power, and they are not just custom, and they have a certain power of decision, and they belong to pre-law. And it's not, I will come later on this question because it's another polemical issue, which of course was rather discreet in the text. Yes, Marcel Detienne and Jean-Pierre Vernant were, as Foucault, disciples of Ignace Meyerson. Ignace Meyerson is one of the founders of the historical psychology. And Foucault worked a lot with him. Jean-Pierre Vernant and Marcel Detienne consider Ignace Meyerson their master. And Ignace Meyerson, I think, is the first translator of Freud. I've not checked, but I think he was the first translator of La Science des Rêves. And he published a year before, or 2 years before the course of Foucault, Les Maîtres de Vérité dans la Grèce archaïque. I don't remember the name of the translation of that book. Master of
The masters of truth in
the mas-
archaic Greece. I
Yes, the
suppose,
master of truth in archaic Greece, yes. And in that book, there is a very interesting discussion, linguistic and philologic discussion of the notion of aletheia, truth. You know, it's a fundamental concept for the conception of truth with Heidegger. And in this text by Détienne, we have a fascinating discussion about aletheia, which is never referred to Heidegger, and which is sort of historical foundation of the problem. I will take just a few elements we may. Yes, Détienne made a history of who was allowed in the antique Greek society to speak the truth. What word has the power of truth? Because truth has a power. To say the truth is to take a power in a discussion. And so how a word has a certain power. And he identified which people were allowed to say the truth. Poets, judges, priests, kings. He made a list. Very few people had the power to say the truth. It was a social designation. And there is a full discussion, but I would be unable to translate it in the exact terms. There's a full discussion. You have it on the pages 18 and 19 of Détienne. An important discussion on what was aletheia, the truth. Aletheia prend tout son sens dans sa relation avec la muse et la mémoire. En effet, les muses sont celles qui disent ce qui est, ce qui sera et ce qui fut. You say the muses, you say the muses? Yeah, the muses in Greek antiquity were the only allowed to say what is, what will be, what has been. You see the relation between time and being. So it's already, we know, it's evident that Détienne has read Heidegger. It could not make such a fine distinction without knowing perfectly Heidegger. He never referred to it. So it is a real distraction of any Heideggerian basis to an important problem in Heideggerian tradition. Muses are those who say the truth. They have the words of memory. And he said that Hesiod, in the Theogony, has established a strong solidarity between aletheia and memory. And aletheia and memory are two goddesses. They are religious power. So all this question of aletheia is not out of a religious world of the remote antiquity. The second register of the poetic word is entirely devoted to war and to the glory of warriors. So another word, which is the word of truth, is the word which makes a laudation of soldiers. And amongst, there's something which is very interesting on page 19. Reading that again this morning, I had the feeling that it has something to do with your society in the United States. Dans la Sparte ancienne, deux puissances redoutables font la loi, la louange et le blâme. Cette société qui a posé le principe de l'égalité entre tous les citoyens ne connaît pas d'autre différence que celle qui découle de l'éloge et de la critique. Chacun y exerce un droit de regard sur autrui et réciproquement, chacun se sent sous le regard d'autrui. He said that in the Spartan society, there were two frightful forces, to blame or to laud, to exalt, to praise. Yes.
Qui font la loi.
He makes the law. And he said that's linked to a democratic society. You know, there's something which impressed the French people when they are in the United States. So people here accept to say that they do a wonderful job and that the person near them makes a wonderful job. We are very surprised because in France we cannot say that. If I want to say a very good job, I have to say he does a very bad job. That's the way to say I'm doing the good job. But we are not allowed to praise ourselves. And here, it was so funny. Yesterday we went to a place and we met a person, and when she left, the other person said, "Oh, she made such a wonderful job." And said, "Oh yes, in France we would have said she's a bitch." And it's impossible to praise each other so much. And for me, it's a mystery every time I hear. And reading that text, I say it's part of a democratic society. So my felicitation. Because it's very impressive to read that little phrases, that a society where blame and appraisal is so important, it's a democratic society. And so what happens when you have no appraisal? You are slowly forgotten. And when there is no more appraisal, there is oubli. Forgetting. And truth is the reverse of forgetting. And it's a couple, and both cannot be separated. And here you have the understanding of aletheia. Aletheia for Heidegger is a privative notion. It's to go out of lethe, to go out of forgiveness. Forgetfulness. Forgetting. Yes, no, it's so there is a strong relation between memory and oubli, lethe. But the way Détienne organizes it is an agonistic way. In a society, memory is a fight. And it can be, there is a counterfight, which is forgetfulness, disparition. And you have another understanding of aletheia, which is totally aletheia in an agonistic society and not in a hermeneutic society. So it's evident that this text is absolutely an interpretation against Heidegger. And it's the basis of the demonstration that Foucault does with history. That it will show that the question of justice is also a question of memory because what is justice in the remote antiquity? It is a oath. I say the truth in front of the gods, and if it's not true, I will be punished by the gods. It's an oath, and it is a ceremony addressing gods and the time to come. And it concerns myself and even my descent. So justice is totally linked to a relationship, agonistic relationship with time. And slowly, justice will be said no more by gods, but by a third party, judges. And at the beginning, judges, they don't make the decision through proofs. They make an oath themselves. They make an oath with one party and not with the other party. But it is the oath of justice which makes the decision. But it is still an oath. It's not a proof. It's just a political aspect of making a decision. And very slowly, we will have a third party. We will make the decision with documents. And the story of going from oath to documents is according to Foucault in that lectures, is the story of establishing justice. And he takes the play by Sophocles, Oedipus Rex, as a sort of remembrance of the whole story of justice in Greece. Because at the very beginning, Oedipus is able to solve enigma. But when he's the king, he's no more able to resolve the main enigma which concerns his own life. Because he is not pure. He has committed crimes. And Foucault relates the whole play to all the history of justice in Greece. And all the parts which has been developed, which are developed in that book, are now resumed in the play of Oedipus. And Oedip is the one who at last will receive truth, not from the gods, not from the priest, not from the queen, his wife, but from a shepherd who have seen the baby and who have received, and the other who have received the baby. So it's testimony. But you see the long story between the recognition of vision as a proof. So it has nothing to do with phenomenology. So you have a long story of how vision became a sense. It's not at all Aristotle, where with vision you have access to nature and truth. It took centuries to arrive that a thing seen is a proof. Voir et dire are absolutely say and see are two important elements of all the books of Foucault. On Raymond Roussel, on the birth of the clinic, of the opposition between to see and to say is fundamental. And we see here how the long meeting of when to see is as the value of a testimony. It took centuries. So at the end of this lecture, there is a sort of reinterpretation of Oedipus, which has nothing to do with Freud. We have nothing to do with the secret truth of the individual, but with the juridical history of truth. That's also a discussion with what Deleuze is going to do with Anti-Oedipus. And it is also a discussion with Lacan and most of the philosophers. There are other elements of contemporary discussion with the other philosopher. There is a long 2 lessons devoted to the birth of measure in the Greek ancient society from Hesiod. It comes from the poem of Hesiod, Les Travaux et les Jours, I've forgotten the translation.
Yeah.
The days and the words.
The days, works and the days, yeah.
The works and days. And through this poem, Foucault analyzed how measures was instituted in the Greek society. And to measure the time, to measure the water for agriculture, to measure the depth, all the system which most have is between gift and counter gift. We have the same system in Hesiod. And we have a long history of measurement, of measures in the Greek society. Of course, you see it's very different from the origin of geometry by Husserl, which has been translated by Derrida and introduced by Derrida a few years before. And we have a long discussion also of how money was instituted in Corinthia, and it's a political institution of money. How to diminish the fortune of the rich without diminishing their power. And there is a lot of discussion about the political and religious origin of the money, which is not purely a commercial technique. Of course, Foucault does not say that it has been everywhere and always the same processes of development. But at least in one city in Greece, we have elements to say that the origin of money was a political element and not a commercial system of exchange. Of course, that's written in when Althusser is a dominant reference for most of the students who attended Foucault's lesson. And we see, we see also that is a polemical discussion. There are a number of other elements. I refer recently to custom and law. And there is a long document about all the differences between a custom and a written law, nomos. And he insists on the fact that it's not only the writing of the law that makes the difference. And it's a full lesson devoted to that. And it just says in one phrase, l'écriture ne fait pas la différence. Just a short phrase, but you know, there is a book of Derrida, Écriture et différence. So you have 12 lessons entirely devoted to Greek history. And you have a total presentation of the intellectual, philosophical century of the 70s. But it does not appear at first reading. And even the people who were the audience said, but why is he always speaking of history? In fact, it's a total new approach of philosophy. And the question of truth, not an epistemological question, but a deeply political question, which we can interpret if we depart from justice and not from science. Science came long time later, when we were in another society where justice had some rule of establishment. So that was the element I wanted to discuss with you, to present. Telling the difficulty it is just to present a text of Foucault, because it has many meanings which are absolutely not really accessible at first sight. And we have to use a lot of side elements to contextualize, which is the discussion you had yesterday. The interest of your presentation was not to contextualize, to decontextualize. And I thought my approach was to contextualize. Yeah. So it's enough for now.
Thank you. So I thought we could open the discussion on these particular passages, but also, one of the most fascinating things about the publication, the historical publication of these texts, and kind of receiving 1970, 71 after we had come to read and understand subsequent texts, brings about this kind of need to kind of rethink the trajectory, rethink when things came into play, and how the pieces and how the books that we've read and interpreted fit in differently. Because this text, as your Situation du cours shows so beautifully, and as you presented it so beautifully, it flows in an arc, it seems to me, with a particular line of texts that then has to make us rethink other ones that we had lined up in a certain way before. So, for instance, it seems to flow in an arc that has vérité et les formes juridiques as a very important subsequent development of so much of the notions of agonistic combat and in veridiction and injustice. And then kind of going underground, it seems, maybe, and then coming back out in 81, about around the time of the Louvain lectures and wrongdoing and truth-telling, where so many of these notions of veridiction and how justice is produced, etc., resurface. But then that makes us rethink a little bit discipline and punish in 75, right? Because it's almost as if discipline and punish, which becomes a case study, right? A case study that grows out of starting with La Société Punitive, but then Le Pouvoir Psychiatrique, a case study in a particular form of disciplinary power, but a particular form of disciplinary power which would be then just a case study in the way in which veridiction is produced at this particular moment, right? And so that's it seems so interesting to me, is receiving these texts later and then having to rethink what was going on, what was being communicated in the different books, right? And so that would push us a little bit to move forward from the particular context in 1970, 71 to the context in 73 and 75 to understand how those were particular, more particular kind of historical interventions at those times. And what's interesting, of course, is that in some passages, for instance, in Vérité et la forme juridique, you get almost a more explicit articulation of what he was fighting against than you do here, right? So when he talks about anti-Oedipus there, he's very explicit, right, about what the intervention is about and what the intervention about veridiction is about, right? He's adamant, in fact, right? He says, I forget the word he uses, but he essentially says, this myth has to be, dismantled, right, in a very kind of, in a very explicit way that it doesn't seem to be as explicit in 71.
Yes, of course, because Anti-Oedipus was not published in 70.
Right.
And it was not even written.
Right.
But in Différence et Répétition, Deleuze made a big presence to the theme of Oedipus. Mm-hmm. Of course, the question of Oedipus and knowledge is in Nietzsche. The question, a lot of phrases which we translated there, where Nietzsche says, who is the Sphinx, who is Oedipus, in the question of truth. And the question of truth is totally connected to the theme of Oedipus for Nietzsche. And Deleuze, maybe because of this connection between knowledge and Oedipus, referred to Oedipus a few times. But for him, psychoanalysis has to be introduced inside history of philosophy. And in a way, psychoanalysis with inconscious and conscious maybe refer to a sort of the question of simulacrum in Plato, and he has to resolve that question. So the question of Oedipus is present in difference and repetition on a philosophical basis, not yet a psychoanalytic basis, but he wants to introduce the question inside philosophy. And Foucault always has been, very suspicious, very critical towards psychoanalysis as a universal analysis of a human subject. In a certain historical formation, it has meaning, but as a universal interpretation of human nature, as far as there is no human nature possible to think, there is no universal psychoanalysis. So at that time, Foucault referred to Oedipus and Nietzsche, and not really to Deleuze. But I think he knows what is going on with Guattari, and there is a change in Deleuze's way of thinking. And of course, when he's in Brazil, the book has been published. And of course, Foucault liked the book, but in a way, he's opposed to a lot of his theses, which are mainly brought by Guattari. And also, you mentioned...
Can you expand on that?
In what way?
Which particular piece is he opposed to, would you say?
No, the fact that Foucault doesn't use Oedipus as a sort of universal truth on our subjectivity, as far as the question of subjectivity is just, I would say, an artifact. It's a reflection. Subjectivity is constructed for Foucault. It's not the constructor. It's not the basis of knowledge. It's a reflexive consequence of certain methods, mainly the Christian approach of spirituality. And so it will be a long developing. But you mentioned discipline and punish before, and in fact, that's interesting. When Discipline and Punish has been published, I think the main reception was in terms of social control, in terms of sociology. It was sociology of justice, sociology of punishment. It was a book rather of sociology and social control. What is it in fact? It's a new system of truth. And we have to refer this book to the other books. Madness and Civilization, it's a new system of truth concerning mental illness. Birth of the Clinic is a new system of truth concerning medicine. And Discipline and Punish is a new system of truth. And issue of sexuality is the same. We have different systems of truth, and we see the construction of them.
Right.
And
right, that's exactly what this shows, right? In other words, that these other texts become these particular kind of instances where there's a fully developed analysis of one small particular form of, right, the expertise of the psychiatrist or the criminologist, right? As a way of developing a theory of truth, right? Yeah.
There is a question which is also very important, and very important in the in this period of our history, 70, with genealogy and with this question of Oedipus. There is that very important question in the 70s: who is speaking? Who is speaking? And of course, genealogy is the question: who is speaking? A genealogy normally is to say who is the nobleman, who is not nobleman, who is speaking. And all this book is about who is speaking the truth. And so I think this volume is very programmatic of what has been written. And you mentioned Mal faire dire vrai. Malferdir is a late book, but it is a real book because it's a reconstruction of things which has been used before and which were really reformulated and with a real organization. It's an entity. Why the lectures at the Collège de France are, in a way, real books because there is a plot, there is a dramatic construction, but also it's material, and he's working on something. Maybe he would not have published all the course we do publish, because that was material waiting how to be reconstructed and used. But this Malferdir is the reconstruction, synthetical approach of different materials he said before. And it's very different from the course of Collège de France.
I wanted to open it up to other questions and directions. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have a question. I was kind of caught onto your statement that you think that for Foucault, history comes to occupy the place that ontology takes in Deleuze. And I was wondering if you could talk a little more about what you think that history is that's taking the place of ontology in the conversation with Deleuze, and what you think the relation, like, is history related to, for example, truth and truth as related to memory, or is history just more of is it a plot that he is using to have a conversation with Deleuze, or?
He's using history in every book. He has been always working with history, yes.
Right,
but there is no ontology in a way. There is no human nature, there is no madness. That does not mean there is no suffering people. It does not mean that there is not a certain existence. I remember a confession Foucault made to someone once in New York. He was using very high drugs. He suffered a lot. And so he had to call a doctor to bring in some things just to recover. And he said, and I have written so stupid thing about madness. So he knew there was a suffering. But between the suffering of a human being and what he described and treated in asylum at different periods as madness, is quantity of scales and stages. So he has been always working with historical material, but historical material is a means to approach something which has no other reality than a historical reality. It's neither skepticism, neither historicism. It's just
here's another way of thinking.
Permanent total history.
What does history do for Foucault that differently? How does he get somewhere different with history than Deleuze did with ontology? I mean, I don't know Deleuze at all, so this is a truly naive question.
I don't think Deleuze paid much attention to history as such. I think he has a broad imagery or imagination of space and culture. I would not say, maybe when he speaks of cinema, and I don't know, he does not refer to history as such, as a material. And it's very strange because Foucault refers to history as an historian most of the time. I mean, he goes to archives. This is the only book, I think, where he referred to historian as such, not to their archive, because it was too difficult, I think, to go back to Corinthian money and so on. So he made confidence. But he reads 80 historians before saying something on the Greek society, of the archaic antiquity. So he referred not to an historian. I remember his criticism from the Frankfurt School. They used historian too rapidly. they would quote an historian. Foucault would use an historian. For example, one course we are looking at together with Bernard Harcourt, Foucault read Porshnev, the Russian historian who had the archives of the French administration and the peasants' revolts in France. Then he wrote the historians opposed to Porshnev. Then he went to all the archives that Porshnev and the opponent to Porshnev used. And the discourse is based on the archives themselves. So there is a real approach as an historian, but using history with a philosophical purpose, which is to derealize every materiality. Does it answer to your question? Thank you. Yes.
You spoke about how the theater of truth changes for Foucault from being the hospital and the asylum and then becoming the court of law. And I'm just wondering, and there seems to me to be a fundamental split in Foucault's classification between disciplines that he sees as being scientific formations built on empirical observation and law as being a completely different systematic form. Is that a fair characterization? I mean, Bernard was talking about different systems of veridiction, but it's always seemed to me that like when Foucault's talking about prisons in Discipline and Punish, he's more concerned with non-legal procedures than with legal ones. Disciplines are very different from legal forms. Is that?
Yes, and I don't know. Maybe he's not there. No, because yesterday there was a very interesting lecture about Schmidt and Kelsen, and listening that discussion between law as law and law as politics, I could not help referring to Foucault and to say he's on neither side, because in a way he has been very influenced by Nietzsche, as Carl Schmitt is influenced by Nietzsche. And if he says that law is politics, he is really Nietzschean. But Foucault is very critical to the fact that with social sciences, and mainly psychology and psychiatry, there are new systems of proof which are used by justice as element for a decision without having the qualification of law. Law, at least, is democratic. It's not more true than any other truth, but it is a democratic decision by a whole population, while a psychiatric expertise is the feeling of someone, and it's neither a science, neither a real expertise. It's a system of value which has no contradiction. And so Foucault is in that case, rather on the side of the law than on the side of the norms, which the social sciences propose norms. And Foucault is very critical to social sciences and is rather on the side of law, even if law is proposing a truth, which is also not a free value law, which is also the effect of agonistic conflict between forces in a society, but at least it's more democratic than social science.
Yeah, but I think I think that a lot of it. I think that it's somewhat difficult to extricate, right, the expert knowledge of criminology and psychiatry from the juridical process. And so, I mean, it's more a question not so much of one or the other as the way in which a juridical process establishes truth, right? And I think it's in that sense that I don't think it would be a question of law or not, or law or psychiatry, but a question of how is it that when how it's and for Foucault it's not a question of transparency, but there is a way in which the veiled nature of decisions that are being made by means of a crutch on, for instance, expert knowledges of psychiatry or criminology is something that he tries to expose in a critical way, right? And so that's the way, and that's the sense in which it would seem that more explicit decisionism in judicial contexts would require less excavating in some way. It would require less critical work, right? It requires less critical work because it's more clear that it's kind of a coin toss, or instead of this notion of a production of truth that is so developed through disciplinary processes, right? Jen?
I think I was just trying to call attention to what seems to me that there's a sort of epistemological similarity between what Foucault calls disciplines that puts them all together: penology, psychiatry, medicine, what population science, that they're all empirical sciences based on observation of large aggregations of data, and that law is a different epistemological formation. So that it's a significant thing when Foucault moves the theater of truth from the asylum or the hospital to the court of law. That I'm just playing around with that.
Yes, I don't think it is discussed, but of course it's not the same status. Because anyway, he's working on a long thread, because the question of the birth of law is also the birth of state. It's a birth of power. And it's also one aspect which is very difficult in this course, because it's, of course, a critical of our conception of truth, but it is also the history of our conception of truth. So we can read these lectures if it was the history of what we accept as a truth. And in fact, in a way, at first reading it may be not so critical. In fact, yes, there is a sort of objective, universal, value-free truth, and it is accepted. But how it has been produced, that is the critique. But in a way, we can believe without the history of truth. And it's not so much a deconstruction of the history of truth, but just the veridiction of what is considered as truth.
So I actually had a question, and then I think I have a comment to this issue as well. So I think it's helpful to remember that in Discipline and Punish, what the book is about is also the birth of criminology as a discipline, and then the way in which that body of knowledge works in the legal system, I would argue, is analogous to the way in which medical, psychiatric knowledge, for example, works in the other disciplines. Of course, this is a special case of the legal system, and it's a very unique case in the history of the legal system. But when transitions into the formation of historically specific systems of truth, I think then the problem for Foucault, which we see in the Louvain lectures, is that the legal system cannot function anymore without the production of certain kinds of truth claims about the criminals who needs to be punished. And in this sense, it's arguably an instance of the super. But my question was more a request for more information, really, about the context. So in the lecture course, we get the contrast between the Nietzschean conception of knowledge and truth, and then the Aristotelian one. And then you mentioned that Heidegger, or certain French readings of Heidegger, at any rate, are another target for Foucault and Deleuze, maybe for Bataille as well. And I think it's very useful to contextualize these lectures in the second wave of French readings of Nietzsche. But I'm just wondering about, I guess my problem is that I would like to know more about the targets. So who would really disagree with Foucault and Deleuze and with Nietzsche? I may have read too much Foucault, so I think it's kind of truistic to make the point that the Nietzschean point about knowledge as being interested and invested with all kinds of relations of power. So we get Aristotle on one side, and then we get maybe Heidegger, and that's something I would be particularly interested in hearing more about. But I'm wondering what other enemies or targets there might have been for Foucault and Deleuze at the time. And just to complicate the context a bit more, I just want to say that the idea of knowledge as being kind of ahistorical and disinterested process seems to not have been not obviously the received view in the French context. If you think about the history of epistemology, for example, to which Foucault belongs in an important sense. So for the whole tradition of French philosophy of science, of Candian, Bachelard, Poincaré, of course it's historical, of course it's specific practices, of course it's all kinds of contingencies that affect the way in which knowledge is produced historically. So that was one understanding of what knowledge and what truth is in the French context. So then, to put it a bit provocatively, why bother making the Nietzschean point that, like, who are you arguing against?
Yes, now, well, you mentioned Foucault belongs to the epistemological tradition of France. I will be not so categoric. I would say, yes, he's close to Candian, who always referred to Nietzsche too, and the only one, I suppose. Bachelard, I don't think Bachelard referred to Nietzsche. I have read Bachelard so long time ago that I don't remember. But I don't think in his conception he was fighting Brunswick, and that was far away. So the only one who is close to is Candian. And Candian, through biology and was closer to a Nietzschean lecture, and he referred many times to Nietzsche himself. There is another, that's at the same time, there are other readings of Nietzsche, which I'm not familiar with, which were linked to Derrida and to Potra. There were a lot of publications on Nietzsche. Excuse me.
Vous allez bien?
Yeah, excuse me. So there were a lot of books which appeared. There was a revival, a different revival of Nietzsche in France. And there was a revival at that time, Boudot, Potra, I don't know how many books. I don't know exactly the differences because, neither Foucault nor Deleuze were so much in polemic with the younger people at the contemporary. They were rather polemic with someone which was rather important in French philosophical scene, that was Heidegger. And so to counter Heidegger was an important project for everyone at that time, for a lot of people for political reasons, where there was a lot of things discovered about Heidegger which have not been really discussed in France. I don't know here if there was so many polemics about Heidegger that they were in France, and Bourdieu, and who was not concerned directly by Heidegger, was in the polemics. And Foucault was not polemical with the other Nietzschean. He was just discussing his own conception of Nietzsche. And to my opinion, also, what Foucault was discussing was Marx. And he found with Nietzsche a lot of things which was interesting for him from the very beginning. We have to go forward, to go further. When Foucault was a student and his masters were de Santi, Marxist, Stalinist, he wrote books about the big issue of that period was the link between science and class belonging, you know Lukács, and this was a serious question. And the most important science at that time, and even with Bachelard, was physics and mathematics. So the discussion was the links between physics and mathematics with class belonging, and and that was also the question in USS, in USSR, about biology and Zhdanov. So the main discussion was the question of the connection between science and social fight. And in a way, Foucault turned to less formal sciences, to sciences more depending from social forces like psychiatry, medicine, and not very formalized sciences like mathematics or physics. And when he wrote Madness and Civilization, we were just getting out of Stalinism and getting out of Zhdanovism. And these questions have been highly debated when he was a student. So he was getting out of that with empirical sciences, more empirical sciences, and he wanted to show there was an order in so-called empirical sciences. And if you say the order of things, he showed that grammar, natural sciences, they were following an order. There was Mathesis Universalis, which was not mathematics. It was not, the model was not geometry, neither algebra, but there was a mathematical order in empirical sciences. And what is the main objective of the order of things? So you have to refer to all that background where people have been discussing sciences in terms of social fight. And Foucault turned from Marx to Nietzsche because Marx has a theory of knowledge which supposes a subject. And the theory of knowledge is the proof of that is that there is the division between knowledge and ideology. And for Foucault, savoir is neither science, neither ideology. It's the state of knowledge at a certain time, and which is a science can emerge out of savoir or cannot emerge, but is something different from science and ideology. So you have to refer to all that background, which is not only epistemologic, but is highly political of the post-war period.
I tend to lose track of time when I'm with Daniel Defert. And so I know we have Kerem wanted to ask a question, and so maybe we should have one last question, and then maybe the answer will be a way to conclude the seminar.
I don't know if it's like going to be ideal for a last question, but I wanted to ask something from the text itself, where you talked about the construction of money
Money.
and currency, and how it's very integral maybe to histories of measurements, and that it's maybe political power worked in the Greek times with the construction of money. Maybe it's a wink of a certain Marxist sense, this talk about money. But I'm also hot back to when he picks up the Greek history in 84 lectures, and there appears the figure of Diogenes, who abrogates currency in a way. So what is that move? I mean, I'm trying to kind of interpret this. Is this like right now we have laid the genealogy of the theatre of truth, so let's look at how to dismantle it maybe, or let's look at how to kind of envision alternative visions of a theatre of truth. Is that that kind of a approach?
I'm not sure I've followed every element. When I mentioned the question of currency in Corinthia, I said it is one case of apparition, of birth of one money in Greece. There was money in other cities. Maybe the birth was not the same, but as far as you have different processes, you cannot say there is a birth of money, which we have in Marx. We have a theory of the birth of money. But as far as we have different origins possible, we have no more a universal approach of the question. And that's the main distinction for Foucault. We have not the birth of the money. We have so many experiences, so we cannot affirm any universal principle concerning at least this.
But also, I would think that it would be, I think what you would want to do is put the notion of measurement and money as a form of production of truth that then gives birth to analyses of other forms, such as the test, and so l'épreuve, right, which is developed after la mesure, or l'enquête in Oedipe, in the investigation as a form of producing truth, right? Money is at the beginning, in some sense, of this series of explorations of different techniques. The examen, the examination, being the form that is developed in Discipline and Punish, right? And in a sense, one can think of it in that series, where Discipline and Punish then becomes the kind of the case study of that particular form of examination as a form of truth, as a production of truth, in relationship to those others. But money and measure would have been in some sense at the seed, right, that was planted here in this text, and I forget to what extent he does point to l'enquête and l'épreuve here, but it's clear that it'll come. If not here, I'm not remembering exactly, but it'll come immediately in 72, 73.
Yes, and another development, of course, I would not tell the story, I would just tell you the problem of how to establish a text which seems simple and which is not so simple. But there is, inside that, the whole question of what was the big difference between Greece and the Oriental kingdoms surrounding Greece. What was the transformation between the knowledge in a democratic society, as democratic as was the Greek society, and knowledge in Assyrian kingship or in the kingships which surrounded Greece, in the Oriental world which surrounded Greece, where knowledge was the property of a king and of the scribes or the functionaries. And the fact that in Hesiod, we have the description of a knowledge which is shared by the peasant. And the question which is developed in this book is the democratization of a knowledge. That's why a shepherd is able to testimony he has seen the truth. But to be the truth, you need a political system which admit the truth said by a shepherd. And it's not only a question of vision, it's a political question. And so it's a question, so the history of truth is politics. You have to remember what is a dictatorship. It's not a system supposed to be based on certain truths. And fighting forbidden truth. And truth is always a question of social conflict. What is truth in a society? You know, since Pascal, we know vérité ici, vérité au-delà. So this is it's not skepticism. It's the real politics of truth. And there was a book recently written about Foucault as a skeptic, and it's a pure nonsense.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to end. It's fascinating. It's wonderful how the workshop today was such a plunging in the historical context of the 1970s. It's particularly magnificent given yesterday the very interesting workshop that we attended, both of us, which was an entire attempt to decontextualize ideas. But this was really kind of plunging it in and reading a text silently through that is silent through all of these conversations that are taking place. That was brilliant, and we thank you so much for coming to the university.
Thank you for this invitation.